can argue with the fact that it can be a droll, mildly amusing diversion, no matter how contemptible you happen to find the participants or their behavior, to cast yourself in the role of devil's advocate, plant your proverbial flag, and momentarily pick a side in that generation's console war. The best way I can possibly explain it is that it evokes an intangible thrill to take something like gaming that is ostensibly as whimsical and non-threatening as is humanly possible and allow yourself just for a moment to take it way too fucking seriously. I guess there's just something innately appealing about pinning that invisible badge to your lapel and boldly proclaiming your undying allegiance to a larger army that from a practical standpoint is effectively impotent. Just ask Democrats and Republicans. And there was a time in gaming when this dynamic served its appointed function and did so admirably, exemplified perhaps no more intensely than during the boom period of the early 90s when a brash young upstart by the name of Sega dared to throw itself at the mercy of an immovable monolith known as Nintendo, and thus the progeny of marketing and capitalism, the video game fanboy phenomenon, came kicking, screaming, misquoting, and name-calling into this world. Sega and Nintendo couldn't have hatched a more effective plot to move Genesis and SNES units if they had actually sat down at a conference table and actively conspired to fucking do so. By encouraging consumer allegiance to one relatively inexpensive console or another during the beginnings of a 90s economic boom, what they were in fact encouraging was for consumers to purchase both. And they fucking did. SNES and Genesis, neither of which had a launch price in excess of $200, were consequently both runaway successes, with Nintendo dominating in North America and Japan, and Sega teabagging the fuck out of the European market, while both remain massively successful and most importantly profitable on a global scale. And Nintendo and Sega are far from the first companies to stumble on this wildly successful formula. Once again, I am struck by the self-evident parallels between video games and the field of my one true passion of comic books. As former editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics, Joe Quesada once explained in this interview from 2003.
And that was the other thing that I sort of wanted to reinstate, that there was this sort of like ridiculous detente between DC and Marvel for like the last few years, where they were doing crossovers, and they were doing this thing called amalgam, where they put their characters together, and it was like, oh God, it bored me to death. And I remember what was cool when I was growing up was the fact that it was DC or Marvel, man. You belonged to one gang or another. It's healthy to have kids at the store or at the bookstore, at the comic shop, wherever it may be, talking about it. You know, and disliking one company or another or whatever, but they're buying everybody's books. But the important of the matter is they're passionate about something. And if it's passionate about loving Marvel or not loving Marvel, that's great, you know, because to me, being passive is just death.
Joe Quesada there understands better than most that Kreia from KOTOR 2 was onto something when she infamously jibed that apathy is death.
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 Statement. Apathy is death.
However, the fanboy phenomenon slices both ways, and under certain economic conditions, such as the ones facing the video game and comic industries now, fanboys cease to be a vehicle for free promotion and begin to cannibalize the very industry they love. It's one thing to pick a side in 2003 when comic book cover prices are $3 at most, but with cover prices now for a standard comic steadily creeping up to that inevitable $5 standard, suddenly the allegiance to one company or the other becomes decidedly more caustic. Completing the analog, it's one thing to encourage fanboys to choose a console in 1992 as the nation is preparing to ascend from the mire of economic recession and into a 1990s boom when one console is $200 and the other is dropped price to $150. Anyone with a standard Walmart paycheck can pick up both consoles and a couple of games and still have money for fucking groceries. It is another thing entirely to cast aspersions on the quality of your competition and encourage a frothing coterie of half-wit fan-fucks to do likewise with two consoles on the market that cost as much as $900 fucking combined, and that's before you buy a goddamn video game, especially in an economic recovery that has lasted 3 times longer than the fiscal calamity it's emerging from, and during which the economy has lost 6 times as many jobs as were lost during the entirety of said recession. Under those circumstances, nobody but the particularly affluent is going to purchase both these plastic bricks, at least not for another 5 price drops. Microsoft, and much more obviously Sony, by promoting the omnipresent fanboy mentality, is unwittingly kneecapping the fuck out of everyone's bottom line. Look, Timely Comics, the company that would eventually become known as Marvel, and DC Comics were of course firing competitive salvos at each other for years prior to World War II. But when those bombs hit Pearl Harbor, you didn't hear another fucking word about how inferior the competition were until the dawn of VJ Day. The only competition at that point were their common enemy, the Nazis. And the subject of every frame of comics from 1941 to 1945, and even for a few years beyond that, was the preferred method of deflowering their eugenically enhanced assholes. Sony and Microsoft, you officially have an enemy in common. This economy is your Adolf Hitler, and if you don't stop foisting facile slap fights like the one we all witnessed at E3 2014 and address the shared menace, in 10 fucking years your video game divisions will be referred to in the past tense. Fanboys, once a boon, evolved into an annoyance, and today they are the cancer steadily eroding away at the industry we all love. I'm Razor Fist. Godspeed!